Okay, this section is going to be real estate documents and escrow requirements. This information is going to be needed for the Pennsylvania state portion of the exam. Okay, so let's get into real estate documents and escrow requirements. Real estate documents. Can you pass a few things out for me, Andrea? One, the consumer notice. It's been approved by legislation and must be specific. So Andrea is going to pass out a consumer notice, an example of a consumer notice to you guys. And then when she gets them passed out, we'll go back to it and go over it. Okay? So the consumer, some documents have mandatory language that must appear in certain documents. Now that consumer notice is a state document, so you have to use that consumer notice exactly the way it is. Exactly the way it is. And we're going to go over that. I'll go over the consumer notice before we get started. So if you're watching this video on YouTube, you may want to pause it right here if you can and pull a consumer notice up so you have one. So what do we use this consumer notice for? Okay. At the first meeting with a consumer, either a buyer or seller, at the first meeting, before you start getting into any substantial discussion, you have to go over this consumer notice. Now, if you're emailing back and forth, you should email them a copy of the consumer notice. If you're talking on the phone, I have little cards. Maybe I can bring them up next week. I thought I had them here. So I'll bring the consumer notice cards up. I have little cards. I may have one in my phone. If not, I keep one in my wallet. Okay. I don't have one with my phone. So basically, the consumer notice, you're telling somebody that they're going to have different options for an agency relationship with an agent. And at this point, until they sign an agreement and agree to work with you, you are not representing them. So they should not tell you anything that's going to hurt their bargaining position because of the fact you don't have a contract with them. So you don't have a fiduciary responsibility to them at this point. And anything they tell you is not going to be confidential. So that's why, Vaughn, you got to get this consumer notice out first thing. If you're talking on the phone, I have a verbal card that I give all my agents. I'll give all you guys one that you can read off. I have one sitting right on my desk. And I usually keep one on my phone here, but I must have gave it to somebody. If you're doing an email back and forth, because do you think somebody, Jace, could email you and they could disclose things that may hurt their bargaining position? Absolutely. I emailed Jason. I said, Jace, I'm interested in your house on 123 Happy Hollow. I'm a cash buyer. I just sold my house and I have to buy something this week. You have to say, whoa, cowboy. When we first get together, I'll go over my consumer notice. But until then, I want to let you know that I'm not representing you. And then you have to read that or send them a consumer notice because I'm not representing you unless we enter into an agreement. So what is a consumer notice? So that's the most important thing to know. And then there's different ways you can represent a buyer or a seller. So the first one, seller agency. Real simple. You're representing strictly the seller in the transaction. The second one's buyer agency. You're representing just the buyer. Then there's dual agency. With everybody's permission, you can represent both parties. So I would circle that on the consumer notice. Then there's designated agency, where if I'm the broker and Ellen and Lauren are my agents, I could designate Lauren to represent the buyer and Ellen to represent the seller. Now, who would I represent in that case? I'm the broker. It's my listing, and I'm designating Lauren to represent the seller, and both of these guys work for me, and I'm the broker of record. And I'm telling Ellen she's going to represent the buyer. I'm a dual agent. The listings are the broker's listings. Relationship with the client. Sometimes I don't even know these clients. But the law states that that client is mine. Same thing with buyers. The agent's the one who builds a relationship, maybe personal friends. But the law states that I legally represent that person. Okay, so if in designated agency, I could designate Lauren to represent the seller. I could designate Ellen to represent the buyer as a designated agent, and then I represent both of them as a dual agent. Okay. Now, if Lauren goes and gets a listing and Ellen works for another company, Lauren would be what type of an agent there? Who would she represent? Lauren got a listing. Ellen brings an offer in. Ellen works for a different company. Lauren works with me. Which one of these three would Lauren be? Seller's agent, right? Lauren works for me. Ellen doesn't, right? Ellen has the listing. Lauren has a buyer for it. She puts it under contract. Who is Lauren representing? The buyer, just strictly as a buyer's agent, right? Because it's not her listing. It's not the office's listing. Now, if both work for me and Lauren gets the listing and Ellen has the buyer, who does Ellen represent? Then there's a next page, or in the bottom there, it says a transaction licensee. A transaction licensee does not represent anybody. They handle the transaction for a fee. Most of the time, Samantha, with a transaction licensee, they've already negotiated. So sometimes people call me up. They say, hey, Tom, I'm selling my house and Bonnie's buying it. I need somebody to handle the paperwork. And then I'll say, okay, I'll represent both you guys as a transaction licensee. I don't represent either one of you, Bonnie or the seller, but I'll handle the paperwork for a fee. That's a transaction licensee. Everybody got the consumer notice? You may see, you probably see the consumer notice, I would assume, on the test. Know that there's 5 different ways you can represent somebody. Buyer agent, right? Seller agent, dual agent, designated agent, and transaction licensee, and know who you would be representing under each one of those. Now, if Lauren is my agent and she has a listing and she sells that listing herself, so she's representing the buyer and the seller, what would Lauren be? Dual agent. Dual agent. If you represent both parties, you're a dual agent. Remember, the buyers and sellers belong to the broker, and you're an extension of the broker. If you're just representing the buyer, you're a buyer's agent. So the mandatory language must appear in this consumer notice. This is exact. You can't modify that consumer notice. And you have to keep that consumer notice for 6 months. So let's say that I meet Lexi and I go to show her a house. The first thing that comes out of my mouth is, Lex, before we look at the house, I have to go over the consumer notice with you. And I say, if you look right on top, this is not a contract. This is a state required document. And what I need to disclose to you is, Lex, that I do not represent you at this point unless we sign a contract together where I'm going to be representing you, and that contract's called a buyer agency agreement. So there's going to be different ways I can represent you, Lex. I can represent you as a buyer's agent. I can represent as a seller's agent, where I'm representing the seller. I can represent you as a dual agent, where I represent both you and the seller, or a designated agency. I can designate an agent to work with you and represent you, and I can designate another agent to work with the seller, or I can work as a transaction licensee. Don't say anything to me, Lex, that's going to hurt your negotiating position, because until you hire me and we sign an agreement that we're going to work together, anything you tell me is not confidential. Okay? Isn't that just a pretty easy thing to understand? And the concept's pretty easy. Okay. So there's other documents, written documents describing services rendered for a fee to be paid, have some mandatory language in it. So remember that there's mandatory language in documents for services rendering a fee. Agreement of sale has to have some mandatory language in it. Disclosure requirements in a CMA. We haven't got to a CMA yet. A CMA is a market analysis, comparable market analysis, and the mandatory language that needs to go in that's going to state this is not an appraisal. Okay. The AOS disclosure required by cemetery brokers. The pre-agreement disclosures required at the initial interview. They could have just said consumer notice. That's the pre-agreement disclosure. And estimated costs to buyer, estimated costs to seller. Do you think, Azaria, that if you're going to buy a house, you want to know how much it's going to cost you before you sign a sales agreement? The estimated cost sheet has to be signed before you sign a sales agreement. If Samantha is going to be selling her home, do you think Samantha wants to know what her net's going to be if we sell it? Yes. So before she signs a sales agreement, and we even do it before she signs a listing agreement, we have her sign a seller's estimated cost sheet, and we figure that out. We'll help you. That's nothing you're going to learn in this class, something your broker or manager will help you with once you get started in the business. So rental listing referral services. Okay. Rental listing referral service. Remember we talked about a rental agent, correct? Right? Now a rental agent is not going to represent anybody. He just gathers information from properties that are for rent, and then he distributes that information to prospective tenants. He don't go and show the property. That's all he does. Okay. And that's language has to be, we are a referral service only. We're not acting at real estate salespersons or brokers. We don't guarantee that the purchaser will find a satisfactory rental unit. I don't know if you know, I don't think you need to know all that language, Jace, to verbatim. Just know that a rental listing referral service does have mandatory language in it. And the bottom line is it's going to state that we are a referral service only, and we ain't representing anybody. But you kind of knew that when you knew what a rental listing referral agent was, right? Right? Good. Timeshare campground contracts. They also have language in them. I'm not going to get real caught up on it, but with a timeshare and a campground, the Real Estate Licensing and Recovery Act allows purchasers to cancel until midnight on the 5th day. I would know that following the day of execution. So if campground, just know this, 5 days for campgrounds. Did anybody watch at American Greed? They just had this thing on called WeWork. Did anybody watch that episode? Well, WeWork is like an organization where you got an office and all different kind of people just like rent a space, and they come in, and then there's a bathroom, a coffee, even some of them have beer, and they all went on. All the employees had to go on a mandatory, uh, um, I guess you would call it like a trip, and they went camping, and they all had their hands up like this. 5 days they were camping, and they were drinking, and they were chanting. So 5 days for a campground, and they were campground membership. They have 5 days to cancel it. And the purchase, I can keep the promotional material. Sometimes they give you a TV or a trip or a free hotel room. So remember that. Licensees must assure that all contract commitments and agreements concerning transactions are in writing. And last time we talked about this, Andrea made a slide for my next Monday meeting, or did we talk about it at the last meeting?
What, disclosures?
No, that all contracts have to be in writing. I think that was last meeting we talked about it. Yeah. The broker, all parties have to receive a copy at the time they sign something. Common sense, Jake. Common sense. So if you don't have a copy, how are you going to give the guy a copy? If you don't have a copy, you only have one copy of the sales agreement. You're sitting at Lauren's house, and she signs a listing agreement. How are you going to give her a copy?
Email.
Yeah, you're going to get your phone out. You're going to take pictures of the document. And you're going to send it to her. There you go. You got documents right now. Or give her the originals and you keep the copies. Everybody got a phone. If you don't have a smartphone, you're not in real estate. The buyer must maintain. The broker must maintain maintain copies for 3 years. So with the consumer notice, how long do you have to keep the consumer notice? How long? 6 months. With a transaction, it's 3 years from the time it was either consummated or terminated. And we keep those files in the cloud, and we talked about that. If the real estate commission comes in and there's a complaint about a particular file, you have to give them all the file. You have to give them the file. Okay. Any questions on that part of it? You got it, Lex? Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about deposits. Escrow requirements. Others' money must be deposited into a federal or a state-insured institution pending consummation or termination of the transaction. So at my office, I deal with PNC Bank. They're a federally insured institution, and I have an escrow account. And when a buyer and a seller come to terms on a sales agreement, and they give us the deposit, we have to deposit that deposit by the end of the next business day. Know that. By the end of the next business day. I cannot commingle that money. So I can't use that money to pay electric bill or anything else. And in that escrow account, if I have to put personal money in the escrow account to cover bank charges and so forth, I'm permitted to. If monies are held for 6 months or more, they should be held in an interest-bearing escrow account. Interest belongs to the person who gave you the funds, the bearer of the funds. Escrow duties cannot be waived. Written authority is required for employees to make deposits. So Liz makes my deposits. I give her written authority to make those deposits, and she can go make those deposits. A licensed employee only can make withdrawals. Okay. Broker must maintain records. When the real estate commission came in last week, they went straight to my records. They wanted to see my escrow records. The commission, they have a right to inspect them. The listing broker or the selling broker, either one of them, can hold the money in their account. Okay? In co-broke situations where broker A and broker B, money is tendered to the selling broker and turned over to the listing broker, unless it's in writing in the agreement otherwise. So the listing broker holds the hand money, okay, unless it's in writing otherwise. Our agreements have writing that the buyer's broker will hold the hand money. So we have that pre-printed in our agreements. So the way it works in Western Pennsylvania is the buyer's broker always holds it because we all use the same agreement. And in that agreement, it's in writing that the buyer acknowledges it and the seller acknowledges that the buyer's broker is holding it. Any questions? We're awful quiet this morning. And again, the broker must put the money in the escrow by the end of the next business day following receipt. If the money is tendered check, if they give you a check prior to the offer being accepted, you can do the following. With written permission from both the buyer and the seller, refrain from depositing until the offer is accepted. Okay, so I would know that. If they, so like if I want to make an offer on Vaughnie's property and I'm using Lex and I write the contract and give Lex the check, Lex would have to get permission from the seller to hold that until we get acceptance. Typically, the check is given once we come to terms. And the agreements typically give you 1 to 5 days to bring the check in. But a lot of times we do get the check with the offer, okay? Taking the money out of the escrow account. So you know about putting the money in the escrow account now, right? How many days does the broker have to put it in? What's that? Next business day. If an employee is putting the money in, the broker has to give them written permission, correct? It has to go into a federal or a state insured institution, right? If the money's in there for more than 6 months, they have to get interest on it.
What does that mean? Like a federal or state?
Well, most banks are federally or state insured.
Right.
Remember the FDIC? You know how you go to the bank?
Yeah.
That's what.
Is there any bank that's not?
I don't know. Maybe Tony Soprano's bank.
Well, of course.
You know.
That's, okay.
So I don't know. But you don't have to worry about that. Let your broker worry about that.
Right.
He has to worry about that. Rental management accounts. Rents received as a property manager must be placed in a rental management account. So when I had property management, Sarah, I had 2 accounts. I had an escrow account for the deposits when they gave me a deposit, and in a rental, you have to give interest to the tenant for their deposit. So each deposit had to be in a separate account so that you could figure out the interest. And then I had a general account, an operating account, to pay the agents, pay for any expenses or so forth that I had. Any questions on escrow? Okay, we're getting there, guys. We're getting there. Let's talk a little bit now about relationships between licensees and consumers. And I think at this point, Andrea, I'd like to stop the video and just do a new video on this. And I would like to give you guys a 5-minute break. Okay? So let's take 5 minutes and then we'll get started and we'll get a new video up on it.